Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patricia YouTube channel. I'm sorry that it's been a minute since we last recorded, but with our Jet Set Traveller here, my co-host Markus and Jack, and my busy work schedule, it's just not been very practical recently to get our schedules to align. But alas, we're back, and with a live session, in the hope that you might interact with us a bit and give us a few questions maybe to answer at the end of the podcast and see what you've been mulling over the last couple of weeks. Before we get into today's session, just some housekeeping. Firstly, as always, please do subscribe. It helps us out a whole bunch. And in addition to that, our other colleague, Mark Philby, has a new YouTube channel, which I will link down in the description for you to check out at your leisure. Again, go over and subscribe to him as well. So, we didn't want to leave you waiting anymore, and we thought we'd continue with our Paul versus Paul series, picking up where we left off in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Markus, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, and thanks to all of you who are listening in to our channel. As Jack has said, we had a bit of a journey, so I spent a few days in San Diego with colleagues in the New Testament studies, had very lively discussions, and I was pleased, for example, to see that in the Synoptic Gospel session, Matthias Klinghardt and my version of the reconstruction and the interpretation of those were given some reflection. And even more so, I think I had useful conversations, and not least, also a session with Jacob Berman of the History Channel. So overall, I think it was a very fruitful conversation there. But now we are back in our session here, and we continue our journey through the two Pauls. Let me just introduce a few thoughts that I had in conversation with colleagues. Where's the big difference, we were thinking, between what we do here and what you are reading in all the introductory stuff of New Testament colleagues? Well, the big difference is that, from my understanding and from my reading, is that all New Testament scholars, at least most of them, I'd say, start with individual writings. So in the case of Paul, they start with each different letter. And they are not interested in what they see as a post-phenomenon, which is the collection of Paul's letters. So they start from Paul as a person, then his writings of individual letters, then ignoring, or let's say not ignoring, but postponing the discussion of the collection per se. Why are we doing it differently? Why do we start with those two collections, those two that are attested in the 2nd century? The later collection, which is attested from the time of Irenaeus, where we have 14 letters of Paul. And why are we concerning ourselves here? Not with individual letters first, and that's why I'm making that statement right now, where we deal with one letter, 1 Corinthians. Why do we not start simply with 1 Corinthians, but with 1 Corinthians in the collection of the 10-letter collection in comparison with 1 Corinthians in the 14-letter collection? A very simple reason. A very simple reason for people who don't even need to reflect upon it. Because when we look into evidence that we have, all colleagues agree, and this is quite a nice thing that colleagues once in a time agree, that for Paul's letters, there is not a single scrap of paper, papyrus, parchment, manuscript, codex, whatever you want. We have not a single piece of evidence that gives us a single letter, which is a standalone letter of Paul. All evidence that there are, all papyri, even the smallest scrap of papyri, people like Nongbre and others give us and say they pertain to collections of Paul's letters. So what we've got is no evidence whatsoever to individual letters. And the same applies to Marcion. Tertullian's commentary is not a commentary on individual letters. It is a commentary on Marcion's New Testament as a collection. and every evidence later on in the 3rd centuries and following. And we have no earlier evidence for Paul except Tertullian that gives us a direct insight into what happens in the 2nd century. All evidence, but including Tertullian, gives us only reference to the collection, and so does Irenaeus. Hence, I think, from a historical perspective, it would be futile to start from single letters for which we have no evidence. So what we can extract and say, if we take those letters out of the collections and then think of these letters being original individual pieces, we make a fundamental mistake. I've said to one of my colleagues, you're putting the cart before the horse. We haven't got a cart and we haven't got a horse. Yeah, all we have got is a horse with a cart and the letters in the cart. And that's what it is. So before making hypothetical extractions from these letters, we have to deal with these letters as we have them, and they reflect a certain redactional level. I give you another example with the Gospels, because I was sitting in this session of the Synoptic Gospels, as mentioned. And Simon Gathercole wrote a very important book about the Gospel and the Gospels. And in this Synoptic session, we had a discussion of this book. Simon was present, and we had an elaborate panel giving fantastic reports, quite critical, but as always, scholars, also friendly and insightful. At the end, we got to learn from Simon that Simon makes the case that the 4 Gospels and Paul with his letters have become part of the canonical New Testament for the reason which he makes the claim in this book, that they both display, the 4 Gospels in contrast to 11 other non-canonical Gospels, that these 4 Gospels display a sort of a core of 4 most eminent theological statements, which we can find, as he suggests, also in Paul, particularly in 1 Corinthians 15. So we are back into our 1 Corinthians, but I have to make you wait a bit until we come to chapter 15. But Simon here makes the case and says both Paul and those 4 Gospels were integrated into the New Testament because they both emerged from an apostolic kerygma. So the apostolic kerygma was prior to Paul and to those 4 Gospels. But because they both match that earlier apostolic preaching and kerygma, the core of our belief, that's the reason why they ended up in the canonical New Testament. At the end of the session, I stood up and raised my hand and was saying to Simon that I believe he has seen a very important thing. Probably the most important thing that he saw was what he didn't see. And what he didn't see is, of course, was that what he calls the apostolic kerygma, so what binds the two together, is not something which was prior, historically prior, in the minds of apostles. I think that is his hypothesis, for which he has no evidence. It's a great idea, but it's got no basics and basis in history. But what he saw, what he called the apostolic kerygma, I said to him, this I would call the redactional idea. It is the redactional profile. It is the profile which was given to those 14 letters of Paul in the collection, which later becomes the canonical one. And this is the reason why precisely those 4 Gospels were put into the canonical New Testament. So not because we have an earlier historical or historically earlier apostles convolution or a core of an agreed element. But this agreed element, I think, is a reflection of the canonical redactors. Why I was saying that and what is my proof for that? Well, I said to them, the same claim we could make for this earlier collection of Marcion's theology and of Marcion's New Testament. Then, because Marcion's gospel has so much in common with Marcion's collection of Paul's letters, that we could make exactly the same claim. Now we could say, instead of calling the canonical an apostolic character, we could say, well, Marcion's New Testament also relies and reflects an apostolic character, which of course I think is nonsense, because then we would have two conflicting apostolic charactera, one of Marcion, out of which he grew, and another one, the canonical one, from which the canonical New Testament grew. How could that be? I think both is nonsense. What I think is the most sensible explanation is that just as Marcion has a redactional profile and an idea of which kind of Paul fits which kind of a gospel, and hence redacts both sides, at least as we will discover to some extent. He also has some difficulties with the text he has, but he redacts both sets of texts, and this appears like a common sense or a common character. And just in the same way, we have the canonical redaction with the canonical New Testament, which reflects and which explains why those four Gospels are in this collection, and not the Gospel of Thomas, not the Gospel of Mary, not the Gospel of Jude, and not any of the other Gospels. So that was my preface. Sorry for being a bit lengthy on that one, but I thought it is very important when we dive into 1 Corinthians that we're not dealing with two versions of an individual letter. What we're dealing with is with two versions of two redactional levels. That's the start. Now, in chapter 2, as you will see, we have parallels as often, or quite often, and differences. The shorter version is, of course, most of the time in the Marcionite version of 1 Corinthians. And here he starts first in reference with the Lord, because the last phrase that we had was, let the one who is boastful boast in the Lord. And how is that happening? By saying, declaring the mystery of God, or of the God, hotheos. Yeah. And if we move a bit down in our second chapter, we read further. So the declaring the mystery of the God, not in plausibility of wisdom. Among the mature, we speak wisdom of the rulers of this aeon who are rendered idle. But we speak of God's wisdom in a mystery which has been hidden, which God foreordained. That's very important, which God foreordained before the aeons for our glory, which no one of the rulers of this aeon has known. For if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of the glory. And just at the end, if that's not already the end, we have, for who has known the mind of the Lord, and who became his counselor. If you move just a bit back in the middle section, yeah, thank you. Here, Tertullian gives us his reading, and I think his reading is not misleading. He says, who is Marcion talking about when he gives Paul's voice in his way? And Tertullian says, Marcion is so stupid, or the Paul of Marcion is so stupid, that he refers here when he says, if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of the glory. He says, the Lord of the glory is the Messiah of the transcendent God. But what is Marcion doing here? Gosh, he's giving an excuse to the Romans and to the Jews that they are not culpable. It's not their fault. They were unable to recognize the mysteries of this God. They didn't know that Christ was his Messiah. If they had known, they would not, as he says here, have crucified this Lord of the glory. And Tertullian says, how is that possible? This is nonsense, despite the fact, of course, that even the canonical Paul is making the same case. But Tertullian says they must have known, because they are to be blamed, both the Romans and, more importantly to Tertullian, of course, the Jews. To Marcion, the Jews and even the Romans are not to be blamed for the Lord's death. Who then is to be blamed? Well, he says, among the mature we speak wisdom of the rulers of this aeon who are rendered idle. Who are the rulers of this aeon? Again, Tertullian gives us a bit of implications, because the rulers of this aeon is not just the Romans. It's not even the rulers of the Jews. It is the ruler of this world and of this aeon, of this time, which is, or who is, the Lord of the Jews and the divines of the Romans. So none of those who rule in this world, be it the people in the heavens, the demons, the angels, any divine, fictional or personal or reality, whatever we call them, and none of those people who have power in this world could know and did know about the mystery, because these were hidden, despite the fact that they were foreordained. And that's quite an interesting one, because we know that Marcion is so meticulous that neither Moses nor the prophets, here we have poor horizo. So foreordained means here horizein is even determined. So none of those people had any insight. So not Moses, no prophet, nobody. And still, here we have that God has foreordained what is going to happen before the aeons of our glory and for our glory. So what happens? In this section, Marcion is saying that the transcendent God, before all the aeons, had envisaged that the Messiah of his is going to come into this world without anybody knowing up front. So we have, if you like, we have the idea of a divine insight of this creation, even of history. So we have preordination, pronoia or prohorizein here, but nobody knew of it. And that's why and how this chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians is so important and links in directly, as I said before, with Marcion's gospel. Because here too, we have no prophetic announcement of Jesus. We have no Baptist. None of that. Christ is coming down straight in the 15th year of Tiberius from above. And he falls, if you like, in the middle of this world. But here we learn it was not just out of heaven, it was preordained by the divine. And yet, nobody in history before, nobody even in history outside Judaism, let alone amongst the Romans or the Jews, knew about this foreordination. That is why he also says this is a God who we call also a God of novelty. Newness, Wolfram Kinzig once has counted the word in Tertullian's commentary on Marcion's New Testament. And he came up in his famous habilitation book on Fortschritt in der alten Kirche, progress in ancient Christianity or in the ancient church. And he counted and said, novelty is one of the most often quoted characteristics in his works against Marcion. Why? Because novelty is such an important term for Marcion. We have this idea of novelty, then Tertullian says, also in the prophets. We have it in Josiah, we have it in Jeremiah. And yet, Wolfram Kinsey discovered that the idea of novelty is a pretty rare characterization which the early Christians not often make use of. The difference is that Marcion is the one to whom this idea of novelty is core. Are you surprised that Wolfram Kinsey then discovered that when Tertullian talks about the New Testament, he always and only makes reference to Marcion's New Testament? And I've made further research and saw that whether it is Justin, whether it's Irenaeus, whether it is other people, it's the same case. Whenever there is talk about the New Testament, this kind of novelty is connected with the collection of Marcion's texts. Here we can see a core passage for Marcion, that it is the Lord and the Lord of the glory, and it's the transcendent Lord who comes into this world preordained, known by nobody. Let's have a look at the canonical text, and we will see how the canonical authors and redactors are working with this text. We need to go just a bit up. It all starts with here. I also, when I came to you, brothers, did not come with eminence of word or wisdom, declaring to you the mystery of the God. For I did not judge to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Before we start with the rest, let me just point out a few elements here. You see, as so often in the canonical version of these letters, Paul puts himself first. What is in the left row a discursive explanation of what happened, or even more, a theological explanation of how this Paul sees the things, pretty much separated or even distinct from him as a person. On the canonical level, you get a preacher who stands like on a pulpit, who exposes himself, makes himself the center of attention, and develops his own ideas as if he is the big authority, while, as we will later see, always at the same time he undercuts himself. But we will see how this works out. Here, he makes himself important. I also, when I came to you, brothers, did not come with eminence of word or wisdom. And you can see it is putting himself the authority first and undercutting in the next sentence his own preaching by saying it's not really an eminence of word or wisdom. But still, he wants to declare something. For I did not judge to know anything among you. So again, he is underplaying himself and uplifting Jesus as his authority, except Jesus Christ, him being crucified. Again, he's undercutting him. I also in weakness and in fear and in much trembling came to be with you, which is quite astonishing. But it's a typical feature which you will only see on the canonical level throughout these letters. Lifting himself first up, making a big splash, and withdrawing because he doesn't want to be too much of an authority and claims that his authority only can come by preaching or by praying of his audience and so forth. And my word and my proclamation were not in persuasive words of wisdom. And you can see here the rhetorician talking. It's almost like Tertullian. He claims that he's not making a rhetorical speech, and all what he does is rhetorical speech. So he says it's not in persuasive words of wisdom, and what he's trying to do is a highly rhetorical persuasiveness of his emphatic texts. But it is a demonstration of spirit and power. And still you can see he's still talking about his own preaching. Whereas in the pre-canonical version, it was about the declaration of the Lord himself, who is not talking in plausibility of wisdom. But here it becomes the plausibility of wisdom of Paul and no longer of the Lord. Now, can you imagine if the canonical text had been primary, that somebody was and would be able to take that text and turn it into a theological text? I think this is rather arbitrary. It is more so that we have a theological text which is quite concise, which is being watered down into a Sunday preaching. Now he comes and you can see the preaching habitus, yeah. So that your faith. Now he's speaking directly to his audience. So he's trying to persuade them, so that your faith not be in the wisdom of humans, but in the power of God. But in reality, he's saying, in my power of how I interpret God.
And if I just speak to that for a second, I've always found this such a fascinating trait of canonical Paul, what I've always termed a faux humility. As one lecturer once put it to me, it's, I'm the least of the least, the nothing of the nothing, but now I'm going to proceed to lecture you in all of the things that I understand over the next 15 chapters or so. And it is a really jarring read when you think about it in that manner, that I'm going to say to you that I know nothing and that I'm not important in this question. And yet, all I'm doing is telling you what to do and how to do it, and claiming a divine authority to do that. So although I might be passing the buck to the Lord and saying it's the Lord who's inspired me, actually, you know, even the assumption that you are that person of God, you do have that divine authority to preach these things, is a direct contradiction to, you know, the faux humility you've just demonstrated about how you're the lowest of the low, or that it's not about men. Well, if it's not about the wisdom of humans, but in the power of God, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but you are a human and you're about to pontificate at me in Corinth for the next 15 chapters in the canon. That just seems like a really jarring sort of position.
And I think it links back to, I'm just reading in parallel what Stephen Nemish has just asked us and point us towards. It is making himself part of that apostolic kerygma in the canonical redaction. Because it becomes quite clear that, just as with Gatherco's thesis, right, it presupposes, as you rightly say, the Irenaean story about a unified apostolic college. And here he makes himself part of that. So it's personalized, it's apostolized, if you like, yeah, and it's referenced to. And just to take the next question, was it Ebert Neslo Kurt Ahlen who had sleepless nights, wondering where the narrative of the New Testament came from? It was indeed Kurt Ahlen in one of the Festschrifts articles, yeah, about the reception of Paul in the 2nd century. Absolutely right. And here we've got that question, yeah. So where is that apostolic kerygma? It's not present in any of our early texts, but it sneaks in the canonical redaction. And now we see that, so that your faith, referencing this type of a kerygma, yeah, that your faith not be in the wisdom of humans, but in the power of God. Yet among the mature, and you now know, the canonical Paul is speaking to his audience. So the people who are reading it become the mature. Among the mature, we speak wisdom, but not the wisdom of this aeon, nor of the rulers of this aeon who are rendered idle, but we speak God's wisdom in a mystery which has been hidden, which God foreordained. We need a bit more text. Thanks. But we speak of God's wisdom, which had before ordained before the aeons for our glory, which no one of the rulers of this aeon has known, for if they had known, and so forth, the Lord of the glory. And people were always wondering, I mean, in New Testament studies who are dealing with 1 Corinthians, who are these rulers and aeons? Because they are not reading Tertullian, so they have a different view from the Marcionite version. And it continues, but even as it has been written, what things I did not see, and ears did not hear, and did not ascend upon human heart, these things God has prepared for those who love him. And now you can see, for us, God has revealed through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. So what is being done on the redactional level? Well, the canonical redaction interprets this foreordained ones and the knowledge of it through the Spirit as what has been revealed to the prophets. And that's the reason why here at this place, another quote from the prophets is being deployed. These prophets are enlightened by the Spirit, and they have revealed it through the Spirit to us. For who among humans, he continues, has known the things of human? So you can see already, the canonical Paul is no longer speaking about God, about the God of the Jews, about the divines of the Romans. This canonical Paul is now drifting and targeting this ignorance to human beings, to those human beings to whom the Spirit through the prophets speaks. So who among humans has known the things of a human except for the spirit of the human that is in him? So also no one has known the things of the God except the Spirit of the God. You can see how they maneuver that the ignorance is no longer an ignorance, a divine ignorance, and therefore also an ignorance of the rulers of these creative or even Roman demon things, but now it's just the human beings. But we have not received the spirit of the cosmic order, so he now differs himself from those spirits of this, of the barbarians and all the rest of the people, but the spirit which is of God, so that we may know the things gifted to us by God, which things we also speak, not in words taught from human wisdom, but in things taught by Spirit, comparing spiritual things with spiritual things. And we continue. Now, a beastly human does not receive the things of the Spirit of the God, for they are all folly to him, and he is unable to know because they are examined spiritually. But the spiritual human examines all things, but he is examined by no one. This is also quite a startling sentence, that the people who are spiritually gifted, they cannot be examined by anybody. So if Paul, the Marcionite Paul, criticizes that the divine knowledge has not been known to anybody, which is an implicit or a direct criticism of Moses and the prophets, here we have the response. People who are speaking in the Spirit, and we have just had the quote from the prophet, they cannot be examined. They are just beyond criticism. And you can see this is also a sort of immunization of the canonical tradition itself, that the canonical tradition is something that one cannot criticize. It is words from the Spirit, and you can see that the idea of a divine writing, which is spiritually done and transmitted, starts with a conscious decision of the canonical redactors. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has counseled him? but we have the mind of the anointed. Another strong statement. Can you imagine that any redactor would have cut out this statement? But it is a typically canonical statement, which you will not read in Paul of the Marcionite version. But here, to make that human claim, because we are gifted by the Spirit and the prophets have been gifted by the Spirit, we have a mind of Christ. Astonishing. Let me just see what Stephen has another contribution to make. Yeah, it's interesting to see that the two redactions of the Pauline letters side by side in this way. The canonical text often seems so rambling, I would agree with you, and directionless in comparison with the Marcionite text. When I first presented this text to Jack, it was exactly the same reaction, if I'm not mistaken, Jack.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't get over quite how disjointed it was, and how even more so the Marcionite version was flowing, because one would assume that when you remove material, i.e. what people suggest about canonical Paul and its movement into the apostolos, you make the text more disjointed, you sort of confuse it, or it seems like it's a dementia sort of reading. But actually it's quite the opposite, is that when we move from if we imagine it as the canonical comes later, it's this extra material that is confusing or changing or manipulating, or in some cases just tangential to whatever the main thread of thought is. So again, I just want to, maybe it's just helpful to just read for you for a second. If we just say, which no one of the rulers of this iron has known. For this, if they had known, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. For who has known the mind of the Lord, and who become his counselor? This is such a clearly flowing text, two pieces that just go together naturally, rather than this absolute waffle that it emerges through verses 9 through 15. And I think just that's really, really interesting. And if I might just examine just as a slight footnote, this word folly, moria. Interesting that it's a real Corinthian special, this word. Specifically a 1 Corinthians special. I mean, it's entirely unknown in the rest of the New Testament. And I was wondering, Marcus, if you know off the top of your head whether it was unknown in all of the Marcionite apostolos, whether it appeared again in 1 Corinthians in Marcion.
Which term was it?
Moria, folly.
If I remember rightly, it reappears, but we need to check again. Yeah, I think it reappears, but we will see.
I can check your concordance while we're speaking.
Yeah, please do. Please do. I just want to hint at this kind of a prophetic statement which is being produced here by the canonical redaction cannot be found in any of our prophetic texts, but it seems to be a reference which is known, for example, to the Gospel of Thomas in number 17. It's also known, or has at least reference closeness to the Ascensio Jesae, to the ascension of Josiah, and maybe a kind of pseudo-philonic taste to it. So we're not sure where that comes from, but it supports, again, the observation. The canonical redactors leave no stone unturned, to try to refute and to make a big case for their own position. Maybe we carry on a bit into chapter 3, because we still have a few minutes to go, and carry on. I also, brothers, which is what you've just said, Stephen, it is a rambling and it's a continuation of this kind of an emphatic speech act between the audience, the imagined audience, at least, of these letters, and this very auctorial person of Paul that puts himself into the forefront. I also, brothers, was unable to speak to you as with spiritual things, but only as with fleshly things, as with infants in Christ. Well, that is another feature you will quite often in the canonical tradition see. It's like a preacher on the pulpit who looks down to his audience. These people are the either moral inferior people, or at least hierarchically, they are much lower than the preacher is. And so he continues pretty drastically. Milk I gave you to drink, not food, for you were not yet capable. For you are still fleshly. For where jealousy and strife are among you, are you not fleshly and acting like a human? The next feature, the discursive text, concise and to the point, of Marcion's Paul, becomes part of a preaching exercise to a congregation, which all, and here, as just Jack has said, with a tangential trajectory here. So we come from people who have not understood the mystery instead of gods and the rulers who haven't understood the mystery. We come to people who haven't understood then the mystery. And now it's the audience who hasn't understood, because they are fleshly people. They are people of strife and jealousy, nothing to do with the mysteries of God, right? But here it becomes a moral appeal. For when someone says, now I'm of Paul, but another I'm of Apollo, you are not humans. What then is Apollo? What now is Paul? Servants through whom you trusted, and to each as the Lord gave. And you can see now the rhetorician comes in. Yeah, he plays a role. It's almost like on a stage where he brings in Paul, the speaker himself, and the enemy Apollo. A whole scenario is being created, and not surprisingly, you will find these people, of course, like Apollo, central players in the book of Acts. So here is the backstage of this kind of a theatrical performance of 1 Corinthians in chapter 3, which reflects back into the book of Acts. And again, I think you can see how the so-called canonical redaction with Acts has a direct influence into the redaction of 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter. And now he comes the big organizer, of Paul. I planted, and you can see how he puts himself into the foreground, sometimes pathetical, I think. So I am the one who planted. What then is Apollo? What now is Paul? Servants through whom you trusted, and to teach as the Lord gave. I planted, Apollo wanted, but the God made grow, so that neither the one who plants is anything, nor the one who waters, but only the God who makes grow. You see, first he plays himself up, then he undercuts him to be at the end the spokesperson of the one who has undercut, namely the spokesperson for God himself. Now the one who plants, he plays himself again in the foreground, and the one who waters are singular, and each will receive one's own reward according to one's own toil. For we are the co-workers of God. Can you imagine the co-workers of God? God's field, God's building, you are. It is a rhetorical twist, like a vertigo, right? Which goes up and down, back and forth, to make and situate himself in the seat of God to make the judgment about the people who listen. Yeah, maybe a bit further. According to the favor of the God that has been given to me, you can see how he imbues the Spirit and God as authorizing him. As a wise architect, I laid a foundation, but someone else builds over it. But each must watch how he builds, for no one can lay another foundation than what was laid. And you can see suddenly the style changes. We had a rambling of a theatrical play on stage. And here, where we have the parallel text of the Marcionite version coming in again, the style and the way the text runs drastically changes. First, still himself playing himself according to the favor of the God that has been given to me. Now stops, and you will not see for the next parts this kind of playing himself. We are back. And here you can see impossible I think it is that a redaction has cut out all these personalities or personal references and all this stage playing to then move back just to a discursive text. If I had 2 pieces of students' work in front of me, I think everybody in my department would say the canonical text is the plagiarism, and the left text is a clever text written by a clever chap or lady, and that's the original one. So here we're back to a discursive text. As a wise architect, I have laid a foundation. This is the only reference here to Paul still, and that may have triggered this whole reductional theater stage. Someone else builds over it, but each must watch how he builds, for no one can lay another foundation than what was laid, which is Christ's. Now, if anyone builds upon the foundation, this one with gold and silver and precious stones, wood, grass, straw, the one doing this, the work, may become clear, because in fire it is revealed, and the fire will evaluate what quality is the work of each. And if someone's work that he built remains, a reward will be received. If someone's work is to be burned, he will suffer loss through fire. Do you not know that you as the temple of God and the Spirit of the God lives in you? If anyone destroys the temple of the God will destroy him. So you can see it is an intense version in the Marcionite text, which talks about what's happening, what is about building, what is the importance of what the audiences are listening to. But it is far away from what we have just read in chapter 2 and the beginnings of chapter 3. Now, interestingly here, the canonical redactors have little to add. Just at the end, they say, "For the temple of God is sacred, which you all are." I think we are coming to the end of chapter 3, and just the last parts. "Let no one deceive himself with empty words. Become fools, so that you all may be made wise. For the wisdom of the cosmic order is folly." And you can see it's a straight continuation of the discussion we had before. So, "For the wisdom of this cosmic order is folly with the God, for it has been written, he who catches the wise ones in their craftiness." And further on, "And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, that they are empty. So then let no one be boastful in human, for everything is yours, whether Paul or Cephas, or the cosmic order, or life or death, or things present or things coming. Everything is yours. Now you are of the anointed or of Christ, but the Christ is of God." And here you can see again, the left text is the text attested. Now, why would Tertullian not give us the name of Apollos here? Well, the name of Apollos wasn't in his copy. And you can see how the canonical redaction has first introduced a Paul who stages Apollos against himself on stage. And now he comes back again in this verse in 1 Corinthians 3:22. It's not by an accident that Tertullian has left it out twice, but it's on purpose that the canonical redactors have introduced the name of Apollos. Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for your question. When you say, incidentally, is there a significance in the addition of the name Jesus after anointed in the canonical text? I think it is. It is quite often, as I noticed in doing the comparison, that when the Marcionite version speaks simply of Christ, you often have the addition of Christ Jesus in the canonical redaction, not that's the interesting thing, where you can see that we're talking about a redactional profile across the New Testament. The same happens in the Gospel, and the same happens in other writings than Paul's writings. For example, in the doxologies, when we have, or in the doxologies, second sentence, and we have it also in the greetings, when in the beginning it says grace and freedom, or grace and irene, and peace is given to you by Christ. And then in the canonical redactions, you will have Christ Jesus. So it's always this emphasis of almost a name taken, because Christ, I think, in the Marcionite version is so linked to the still idea of him being the Messiah. In the canonical redaction, it becomes a title. And that's why the title is given then to Jesus. So I think you have seen a great difference between the two versions. Jack, I'm running out of steam here with chapter 3, and if you all agree, I think we can leave it for today at this point. Maybe we take one or two questions in addition to the ones we have seen online and live today.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you so much also, Stephen, for your donation. That's really kind. We're really grateful. Hopefully we can buy some new equipment for Marcus and, give him the high fandango stuff that I have, and we can sort everything out sound-wise and visual-wise. So at the end of each episode, to try and help address some of the questions, rather than Marcus and I going through all the comments and doing it quite time-consumingly, I thought we'd just pick a couple every now and again and take a look at them briefly, because most of them don't require that much effort. Although the ones that do, Marcus and I had a chat pre-show to think about some of the answers that we don't know the answer to yet, some of these questions that we're going to go and think about and bring to you in a future episode. So just a couple of quick ones to finish. Question here. Hi, Dr. Vincent. Will there be a Kindle version of your books about Marcion and the dating of the Synoptic Gospels and the Tertullian preface? Do you know?
I just had a session in San Diego with the publisher Peters, and they are attempting to produce PDFs of these books, which then could be transferred to a Kindle version, because I think that would be extremely helpful. But on an individual case, I mean, just send me an email and I can help you out.
Good. And
and please also, because with Peters, these books are out of copyright as soon as 2 years have passed. So we have an open access policy in this respect. And if you go to my academia.edu profile, you will find the PDFs already there, and they're free of charge.
And then what you can do is send them to your Kindle via your Kindle email address, and then you can get the PDFs on your Kindle.
That's what you can do.
Which is great. It's not ideal because you can't enlarge and decrease the size, but better than a kick in the pants.
Yeah, and it's free of charge.
And it's free, yeah, exactly. Next one, and perhaps this might require a whole video, really, but we can give a short answer. Someone says, less of a question, more of a statement. It seems like Acts had an influence on the redactions. He's referring here to Paul as well. Simply, yes.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
And lastly, just slightly off topic, one of the easy questions. Someone commented on one of the ones about Ignatius of Antioch, saying, so you're saying the epistles, presumably the 7-letter collection, were written in the 3rd or 4th centuries? Are they forgeries from the 3rd and 4th centuries? Now, I'm glad that this question was asked. We've not done anything with Ignatius on this channel in a while, and so I think it's high time that we did. I briefly teased a little while ago that we would do in a similar fashion to this an Ignatius versus Ignatius series, because I think that would be very enjoyable, though less popular because Paul is the favourite and Ignatius is only the warm-up act. But just to give you the quick answer to that, I think that the 7-letter collection are a end of 2nd century, maybe early 3rd century creation. So they exist in a canonical world and a canonical universe that is after all of this great Pauline redactions, if not contemporaneous with this Pauline redaction stuff that's happening. It's almost like they've taken all of this early Christian literature stuff, put it through the funnel, and added in every sense what they wanted, to the point where it's not only the case that we see similar theologies, but even similar wording, similar syntactical styles, this random tangential story time, I think I've called it on the past on this channel. So there does seem to be a general sort of cohesive redactional process going on across all of these texts. And I hope to speak on that more in the future when we look at Polycarp versus Polycarp and Ignatius, etc., etc.
Yeah, and as you can see, the reduction processes don't stop, right? So we have in the 4th, 5th century, we have this reduction, which then adds these other 6 letters to the Ignatian corpus. And in Paul, the same way, we have further letters which are being added. And this is part of the nature. People want to gather as much material as they have, and the bigger collection usually are the ones that win.
Yeah, and particularly in the cases where, one would have to suppose, if they accept that people are redacting these texts rather than adding stuff to them, removing things like the word Jesus, as Stephen correctly identified today, just seems to me entirely not just unlikely, but an impossibility in the mind of these people. Hey, I'm a Christian, I'm around in the 2nd century, you know what I don't like in this text? The name Jesus after the word Christ. I don't know, that seems a bit suspect to me. So, just a reminder, please do subscribe, not just to our channel, but over on Mark's channel as well, link down in the description. And we look forward to seeing you next time to discuss more of Paul versus Paul, Ignatius versus Ignatius, and whoever else we can find to pit against each other in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. In the meantime, have a good one, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.